The year is 15 Ante-Laurentium. The establishment of Fort Auckton and the introduction of slavery has had a profound impact on the larger kingdom of Rostock. King Edward the Magnanimous has sat on the throne for 44 years now. At age 56, Edward has overseen the radical expansion of his colonial possessions. Once useless tracts of land inhabited by unruly natives, to now prosperous territories with burgeoning population centers, rivaling even the cities of the home islands. With new innovations in sailing technology, trade between the colonies and the motherland has become easier than ever, bringing vast riches to the crown. However, when Edward looks upon his empire, he sees his citizens in deplorable conditions. Thinking himself to be an enlightened monarch, he embarks upon a grand campaign to renovate and modernize both the cities of the home islands and those of the colonies. Fort Auckton, one of the most far-flung strongholds of the Empire, is a prime example of this. Built to protect the Cardiffil Straits and Rostock interests in the region, the fort has done little to better the conditions of the residents of the island. Boasting open sewers, little clean water, and a complete lack of urban planning, it has turned this boom town into a slum, with all but a few merchants living in inhospitable conditions. Free citizens who live in the city are relegated to a life of toil, serving either the wealthy landowners or the military elite of the settlement. Day in and day out, impoverished citizens work tirelessly to provide for their families and make ends meet. And that is the fate of the lucky few who are not slaves or indentured servants. However, Edward's plans have run into a problem. The local slaveholding plantations refuse to sell their land to the WOC for renovation. Indeed, the great wealth of local slaveholders eclipses even the power of the crown this far away from the home isles. As a result, the WOC, under Edward's direction, establishes the Colonial Settlement Corporation and begins construction of the new city of Auckton as a model settlement and a new capital of the Cardiffil Straits district. This is where we begin. As always, welcome to Auckton. Heyo everyone, welcome back to Auckton. So, the goal of today's project is to create the first planned settlement in the entirety of Auckton Island. So to make room for that, I unfortunately had to delete the old remains of a native settlement. But that is, unfortunately, how history goes. A lot of settlements and historical sites were wiped out to make room for future development. So this is a big deal for Auckton, because up to today, all of the previous settlements, which have now been here for a couple of centuries, were basically not, they had very little, if any, planning. But King Edward, taking inspiration from Renaissance thinking, of course, the Renaissance, this is a different world than ours, so the Renaissance doesn't have an exact parallel, but King Edward wanted to make a more modern settlement. So as a result, I placed down that concrete there. I'll get rid of it later. But it gives a good idea of what is the true northeast, south, and west. So many settlements of this time were planned in accordance to like the cardinal directions and whatnot. Of course, they made accommodations for natural features, like I am with the shoreline. But a big part that guided settlements of this period were which way the compass pointed. But yeah, so I'm going in here, I'm laying out a basic grid this grid is very large. I'm aware of that. But again, these settlements were planned to have these large blocks with wide avenues, and then smaller alleyways to break up and subdivide the blocks. I'm taking some inspiration from the plans of, I believe it's Savannah, Georgia, among other kind of remaining colonial etchings from this period. New Orleans is, of course, an inspiration. We will have a pretty decently sized town square reminiscent of Jackson Square, which will eventually get modernized to kind of reflect that inspiration. But yeah, so just going through here, I'm now doing the alleyways. It is a little difficult to kind of guesstimate where alleyways need to go before I place buildings, but I did still want to get a basic picture of how I wanted the settlement to be laid out. So you may have noticed that these roads are all dirt, and that is very intentional. So it was very pricey to make cobblestone roads. Like, you have to obviously quarry the stone and then ship it over to where you want it, and then, you know, actually put in the time and labor to install the stone roads. That's why there is cobblestone streets in the older settlements. So New Wolverhampton, New Lockport, and Southvale all have cobblestone streets in certain areas, mostly in their near their central squares. But those settlements have also been there for, like I mentioned, a couple centuries. This is an entirely new settlement, and I find it unlikely that the chartered company making this project would actually take the time and resources to go through the effort of bringing in all the stone. So this is not a great place for a port, I recognize that. But I looked at it and there was this little sandbank. So I figured that the colonists would probably drop a bunch of rocks and whatnot to stabilize the sandbank and turn this entire little area into somewhat of a sheltered bay. I tried to put trees on it, but obviously it didn't work. So yeah, this area, it's still very exposed, but it's already in a bay. Sure, that bay faces toward the ocean, but with that sandbank, I imagine it's still good enough to have ships come in and out. In hindsight, I wish I had detailed this port a little more. I, of course, did that little dirt area to signalize that there's activity going on, you know, carts being unloaded and loaded, and all that good stuff. And then I put down these fishing docks, but I should have gone through and added crates and whatnot. So these houses, these Georgian houses, were made by, I'm now told, is a YouTuber called Do Not Eat. Previously, I mentioned him as Dono Teat. Turns out that when you don't hear a name pronounced, you can horribly misinterpret what it's supposed to be. But yeah, these were made for his series called Franklin. I highly recommend going and watching it. I believe it's not being developed anymore. But from his video, these houses were meant to be for the more wealthy citizens. So these would be free shop holders or shop owners, businessmen, stuff like that. And then behind, you'll see me in a second. I'm working on this little corner here. Behind these houses were called Trinity houses, and those would be for poorer citizens, servants of other houses, and all that stuff. So yeah, the main boulevards are going to have these larger Georgian homes, and these side roads are going to be much more cramped with the Trinity houses. You can see how much smaller they are than the main house. It's been, I believe that these houses would house one family on each floor. I went into realistic population and adjusted the settings for each of these houses, but I didn't put it up that high. So yeah, these Trinity houses were very cramped, whereas the Georgians that front the larger roads were for more wealthy citizens, and as a result were much better in terms of living conditions. But yeah, so that's the basic layout of how the city is going to go. The larger and more important roads are going to get these Georgians, or sometimes, even alleyways, but I make sure to back the Georgians off from the road to give them a bit more access to fresh air and sunlight, whereas behind the Georgians will be alleyways filled up with these Trinity houses. This is a big shift in how planning in Auckton has been so far. Usually it's been, single family timber frame houses, but now we're starting to move into masonry and brickwork. And that's reminiscent of the changing times. So I mentioned in episode 5 that we were roughly in the equivalent of the 1650s to 1670s. Even though it's only been, I believe, 6 years since the last episode, in terms of in-game time passed. I wanted to show the shift in architectural styles that was occurring. Around this time, brick construction became very common, including these row houses. You see some artwork from this era, the late 1600s to early 1700s, that showcase this new trend in urban planning. Because the colonies were very reminiscent of old world cities as well. They were begun organically, but as Renaissance thought kind of took over in the old world, leaders would experiment with new ideas in city planning and whatnot in the colonies. And as a result, you see settlements like the city of Auckton taking shape, which have very, I suppose, almost modern architecture. So what I'm working on here is, well, now it's gone, but what I was working on, that big brick building, you can see a couple more back there by the port, is the first manufactories. So the city of Auckton, along with the neighboring towns, are very big cotton producers. Cotton is used in textile manufacturing, obviously, to produce clothes. Most of this would be done in the home isles, so the cotton would just be shipped raw in bushels back to the home isles and then manufactured there into clothing. But some would still be produced into textiles, both for importing back to the home isles and for usage by the colonists. These early manufactories, if you don't want to call them factories yet, were not steam powered. They did have that brick construction that's reminiscent of, modern times, but they were pretty much operated entirely by hand at this time, because steam power hadn't quite yet been invented. That'll be another 80 to 100 years. So yeah, we are beginning to see the very early beginnings of what will become the Industrial Revolution. So here, by the central square, I'm working on a large church. Religion was still a very powerful factor in colonial life. Of course, everybody knows about the Quakers and the Salem witch trials and stuff like that. So I try to make sure to include a church in pretty much every settlement I build. Of course, because this is not Earth, I still haven't figured out religion. But yeah, this is not a Christian church. This is some other religion native to this world. But yeah. So yeah, because of how powerful and influential religion was at this time, I made sure to actually make the grounds of the church look pretty nice. So I plant all these flowers, I make the graveyard quite large, plant all these trees, because the clergy would be very influential and as a result receive a lot of money in tithes and funds from the government. So Auckton, the city of Auckton, I wanted to be the new colonial capital. Beforehand, this was taken by New Wolverhampton, but it's also a very crowded and kind of dingy city. So I figured the government would spend quite a lot of money to make a new administrative center here in the city of Auckton, both because of its central location on the island, and because it's a statement um, of what a city can be. Of course, in reality, it's surrounded by dirt. The trees planted around it, are still surrounded by dirt. It's a very dirty place. You could also see there I placed a central well because piped water is not. It is a thing, but it's not very common, especially in these New World settlements. And then a few merchants have set up in the central square naturally. So I'm showing this part. It's not much different from what I've been doing, but I wanted to show how I'm tackling the rapid, I suppose, undensification. My brain is failing me. I can't think of the word right now. But because the city of Auckton was planned from the get-go, pretty much this entire area is still planned to be more row houses. So the company building this settlement would still own all this land and be actively building more row houses and residences for future expansion. However, some of these houses probably wouldn't have been built. That's why there's gaps in between buildings because of like either budgetary constraints or resources aren't available yet, or etc., etc. So as we go closer and closer to the edge of the town, we see these gaps in these buildings become larger and larger, and more areas where dirt and building materials show through. I mean, again, this is a dirty town, so there's dirt everywhere, but, my point is still made. The further out you go, the more gaps there are in houses, and I feel that's a good way to show that the city is still rapidly expanding, but we're decreasing in density and moving toward the countryside. So why are we doing this grid that's based on north, south, east, west? Of course, everybody knows about how New York was planned, but it's not actually quite that. Outside of the old New World cities, large land surveys were taken, large land surveys were made by both the English and Americans, and pretty much platted out the entire New World east of the Appalachians. Of course, later, under Jefferson, this gridding system was expanded beyond the Appalachians. That's kind of why the Midwestern states, and I mean, hell, even areas east of the Mississippi, have a sort of squarish gridded shape. If you zoom into any area in, like, Kansas, you can see these massive squares just going around. Most of these roads, I have to quickly extinguish a fire there, most of these roads will likely not be used for a very, very long time. But they're there, in essence, to simply mark out terrain and for any future property selling the government wants to do to its citizens. But yeah, that's more or less the entirety of the city of Auckton. But as I work on fixing up this grid, the question remains: how did the city of Auckton become funded to begin with? The wealthy plantation owners you see there by Fort Auckton were very reluctant to sell any land to the colonial company building the city, and as a result, I'm currently working on figuring out the grid because I thought I went wrong somewhere, but then I realized I was fine. The plantation owners were not going to sell their land because of how much money they had and how much political clout they had. They were very reluctant to allow development on their property. Even though it would have made them very wealthy, they saw that they could be wealthier by just continuing to make cotton. As a result, the city of Auckton is a little ways away from the original Fort Auckton, making a very distinct divide between the two. With time, Fort Auckton will be absorbed into the city of Auckton, but for now they are very separate. So with the plantation owners not willing to sell their land, and with limited ways to fund the project, the city of Auckton, or the colonial company building the city of Auckton, sold off a lot of land on the city's periphery. Eventually, of course, the city plans to reacquire this land and redevelop it into more housing and whatnot. But for now, these owners, which were explicitly given smaller portions of land, um, have funded the initial construction of the city, including the Capitol building and churches and public services in the area. But as a result, we see the large increase of even more cotton, the importation of even more slaves, the exploitation of more people. So I'm moving here at this farm main building. That way I can, you know, start building these farms. I won't go into every single farm that I build. I'm doing this one. It's just a simple corn farm, moderately sized estate, but a single family probably owns and works this land rather than, you know, a large operation. I just kind of wanted to show how I'm going about building these farms. So around every house that I placed earlier, I'm putting down a couple of fields. This one actually gets a stable. I don't actually build any more stables, but I thought that was a cool detail. Um, and yeah, so each of these properties gets at least a field or two. And this one, because it's a moderately sized property, I'm also putting in a livestock farm. But yeah, this farm in particular, like I said, is probably just a single family, probably a couple generations of the family working it. But this one here, which has a even larger apportionment of land, is going to unfortunately be a cotton plantation. So this one has a large cotton field along with a large wheat field to feed both the property owners and the slaves, and to sell off any excess back at local markets. And here I'm just working on, you know, the slave houses. It's not a great thing to have to build, but I want to stick close to realistic depictions of history as possible. And with this being a southern, you know, a city based on the South, this was a big part of its history. So yeah, big old plantation house there, surrounded by live oaks, just to show off wealth. And yeah, it's even going to be fenced off from most of the rest of the property as well, just to show the divide between the owners and the people who actually work this land. But yeah, just going in here and placing down dirt everywhere, naturally, to show activity, and moving on. But not all of these farms are going to be particularly large or wealthy. This property here that I'm working on is simply an apple orchard. So some lucky landowner managed to purchase this land and decided to just, or excuse me, it's oranges, not apples. There will be an apple orchard that I'll show later. But yeah, not everybody at this time was evil. Not everybody at this time was trying to exploit others. This is just a single family working a small orange orchard. So yeah. Of course, the exploitation of people was very common. I'm now working on that apple orchard property I mentioned earlier. This is a apple orchard and a single property, or single landowner again. But yeah, unfortunately, because of the way in which this project was funded, not everybody is so lucky as to be able to snag a piece of land. People that were already independently wealthy, likely from plantations, snagged up larger portions of land, whereas the very lucky few who are able to buy smaller apportionments of land are more or less relegated to do lower yield crops such as cotton, or not cotton, wheat and vegetable farming. This is the final large property that I'm working on. This, of course, is where the farm main building is, game-wise, but this is also going to be a very large cotton plantation. Likely the largest I built in the entirety of the island of Auckton so far. So this whole area is dedicated solely to cotton. the landowners are so wealthy they don't have to worry about feeding their slaves in terms of their own property. They don't have to set aside land to feed their own slaves. It's simply cheaper for them, because of the economics of scale, to have so much land dedicated to cotton that they'll just simply buy food, both for themselves and for the slaves. Which means that the larger you get, the more exploitative slavery becomes, because it's not like the landowners are buying good food for the slaves. In all likelihood, the slaves by their houses would likely start small gardens for vegetables and other food. But yeah, that concludes this episode. Enjoy the cinematics. Have a good one. So, was King Edward's project successful? Well, the city of Auckton now houses hundreds in cramped conditions. The wealth disparity between the haves and the have-nots is as wide as ever. Sewage is still dumped in the streets. People are sold every day at the port as ships offload their human cargo, only to return to the home isles with holds full of cotton and textiles, as the property around the city of Auckton has been sold off to the highest bidder to fund the project to begin with. The landowning elite are more entrenched than ever, as this new capital continues to grow rapidly to feed an ever-hungry economic machine. Well, that's the end of the scripted portion of the outro. I hope you really enjoyed this episode as we go into these cinematics. If you did, please like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. I also have a Patreon where I've been putting up a archive of all of the raw footage that goes into Auckton. This has been edited down from, give or take, about 4 hours of raw footage. So yeah, this has definitely been one of the most intensive parts of Auckton so far. I really enjoyed seeing the last video get as many views as it did. Fort Auckton, when I was building it, was really fun to do. It was the first time I've really gone super in-depth and detailed in a project, and I think it really came out really well. If enough people join my Patreon, eventually I plan to start holding polls and have like a council that decides the direction of Auckton. So yeah, please consider giving it a look. Well, as we do this final pan around the whole of the island, I really hope you had a good time watching, and please come back next time. This is the Kumu Courtway. Have a good one.